Anyway, really, thank you very much for coming. When Jan and I were talking about this event, we had no idea if there'd be 3 people or 10 people or 20 people. And today, as I was walking around, people say, I'll see you this afternoon. I'll see you this afternoon. Oh, you're all lying. But you did come, most of you, and I'm really glad you did come. So let me just explain a little bit to the background to this event. It's named in honor of Lung-Wen Tsai, who was a PhD student of mine in the 70s, and unfortunately died before he was 60 years old. I've had the misfortune of having, as far as I know, 4 PhD students die, and someone says, what's common between them? I said, me. Ian Javo is from Nigeria. Dinos is from Greece. Sutherland is from Canada. And Lung-Wen Tsai was from Taiwan. So it's really unfortunate, and you know, it's like losing part of your family. At any rate, so we decided, fortunately in his case, the family and friends put together a little bit of money so we could do a series of lectures in his honor. And this is the last one in the series. I retired in January, and it's time to move on. But COVID sort of destroyed our pattern. And this is about the 4th one we're doing. And the way they're all different. And I was fortunate to have Jan here. Jan is a researcher from Germany, who's a postdoc researcher, who's been around Stanford for quite a while. And for several years, he and I researched the origins of design at Stanford. And we thought it would be a really good thing for him to present the beginning of his results. We've published about it, but he could make a presentation based on that. So what we decided for this afternoon is Jan will start out and talk to you about the very beginnings of Stanford, and then I will talk to you about Lung-Wen Tsai as an example of what happens, because, you know, especially students from foreign countries, they think they got into Stanford, I got it made, and life is over. But I got bad news for you, life is just beginning. And all the stuff like illness and divorce, you name it, anything you can think of happens to Stanford PhDs. And Lung-Wen Tsai he was very successful in the end, and he had a really interesting life of touching a lot of bases. So I thought it would be a really good example to show you a concrete person and their life. So that's what we're doing. So Jan, why don't you start?
Thank you so much, Bernie. Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Bernie. I just want to quickly say thank you to Bernie, because all of this would have not been possible without him. So, thank you. I'm going to talk really about these early years at Stanford. And I want to start with a personal story of why I started this, why I was interested in it, why would I even care about this kind of like history. And so one of the things that I've read way before I heard about Stanford was this book called The Experiences in Visual Thinking by Robert McKim. And so I got interested in particular Bob McKim and his work, and I had to beg a good friend of mine, Bill Clancy, Bill sitting here, to take me with him to Santa Cruz to meet Bob McKim. And so here you can see me on your left-hand side, Bob McKim on the right-hand side in 2019. And so, of course, you can't see Bill because he's taking the picture. And so I had this wonderful half day with both of them, and we had various questions to Bob. And one in particular asked, when did you come up with this idea of need finding? And I'm paraphrasing here. He said something around, in 1965, in front of the Green Library, I came up with the idea of need finding. And I was like, whoop, that's very specific. Especially in 2019. And so what I did a couple of days later, I went to Bernie and asked him, Bernie, can you tell me, when did Bob McKim come up with need finding? And Bernie said something around, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't know, it might be before visual thinking, might be after the book that published in '72, but I'm not sure. And then he said something so important. He said, but that's very easy to find out. And I was like, what? How? And he said, just go into the library, look into the bulletin, look which year he uses the term link finding. After that meeting, I ran over to the library, asked them kind of like, where can I find the bulletin? They were like, don't worry, they're all online, you can download them all. And so rather than looking for just need finding, I downloaded every single bulletin, copied every single course out of the bulletin, and built an entire timeline of all of courses. And here you can see just a couple of them. And so just to point out, for example, John Arnold, who I will talk about in a moment, he started, for example, a course called The Philosophy of Design, or Comprehensive Design. McKim started something like Advanced Product Design. And so you can see here a bit of the evolution of a couple of courses.
Thank you.
But we kind of like, in overall, there are over 600 courses in this kind of like evolution. And today I will only talk about this very early part. Because I think here, a couple of people came together that really changed the trajectory of design at Stanford. And so here you can see some of the people that came in these early years. And so I will talk about all of these people in the kind of order of arrival. So a guy called Matt Kahn arrived in 1949. Then, there you go. John Arnold, a superstar, came in '57. Unfortunately passed away in '63. Jim Adams joined as a PhD student. Robert McKim, who started the product design program in '58. And of course, in '62, Bernard Roth. Of course, so let me start a bit kind of like, what are these origins of Stanford design? And so, let's talk first about kind of like a really young man, who arrived here at the age of 21, started teaching at Stanford. And so Matt came out of New York and was educated at Cranbrook Academy of the Arts. But Matt retired in 2009. He's probably the longest serving kind of like teaching faculty at Stanford. And so Matt had a very long, prosperous career. But I want to talk a bit about his education at Cranbrook. Because Cranbrook was, at that time, something that was absolutely groundbreaking. Cranbrook was started as the kind of like idea to bring an American Bauhaus-like art school and develop that. And it was kind of like really deeply grounded in this idea of arts and crafts and Art Deco. And it had this whole education around one artist in residence who then works with a really small group of people. And so an architect called Elina Saarinen from Finland, who built or designed the train station in Helsinki, he moved to the US and he got hired to actually build the school. And he became the very first dean of the school, exactly at the time when Matt Kahn was there. And so just to give you an overview of the amazing designers that came out of Cranbrook, here are, for example, Florence Knoll, one of the absolute superstars. Ray Charles, she met, Ray Eames, she met Charles in Cranbrook. And of course, Eero Saarinen, one of the greatest American architects, who was the son of Elina Saarinen, came out of Cranbrook. Exactly the same school that Matt Kahn came from. And of course, Cranbrook really influenced design worldwide. The legend goes that in Sydney, that the Australians rejected this young Utsen's kind of proposal of the Sydney Opera. And Eurosarian came later and said, no, that's the one. And so Sydney Opera, according to the legend, was chosen by Eurosarian. And so Matt was one of them who came out of Cranbrook. And of course, Matt not only taught here, but he was also a practicing designer. For example, he collaborated with Joseph Eichler, where he, with his wife, who was a weaver, kind of like did a lot of the special arts and the sculpture, the interior for the Eichler houses. And so Matt brought this wonderful arts and craft education to Stanford. The next one who arrived in 1957 was this amazing polymath called John Arnold. And John, born in Minnesota, was this kind of like person who was able to kind of move between psychology, design, and engineering. And he joined in 1957 the mechanical engineering department with a joint appointment in the Graduate School of Business. He taught product development courses at the business school, as well as in engineering and design here in the mechanical engineering department. And really interestingly, Arnold got educated at the University of Minnesota in psychology, became a technician, and then got an engineering degree. And he brought together at MIT, where he became an assistant and an associate professor, this idea of creative engineering. And here I want to quickly point out Bill Clancy's amazing work. He has researched Arnold for years, and there's an upcoming book called, what is the name?
Philosophy of Comprehensive Design.
Thank you, The Philosophy of Comprehensive Design. I'm super excited about that book because this will be a whole kind of like all the writings that Arnold did over the years. And so Arnold brought this kind of creativity to engineering. And Bernie told me that when he was an undergrad, the word creativity in engineering just didn't exist. And so, of course, there were other publications which kind of like creativity in engineering and creative engineering. But I think Arnold was one of the most important. And I'll explain a bit in a moment why. So Arnold established what he called the Creative Engineering Laboratory, where he had these summer seminars working with an amazing group of people. But also he started a course called product design. And of course, very famously, we called it product design, while the rest of the country called it industrial design. And interestingly, I could find one other school in the 30s and 40s that used the term product design, and that is the Institute of Design in Chicago. And interestingly, György Kepes from the Institute of Design moved to MIT 3 years before Arnold called it product design. While I haven't found evidence that they talked or they influenced each other, I know that Arnold read Kepes' book. And so here is something that I still have to kind of like dig into and research. But just to give you an overview, a quick idea of what Arnold as a polymath and what he kind of like, who he worked with, only in the 1950s. So he brought together people from psychology, someone like John Brunner, Abraham Maslow, J.P. Guilford, who very famously gave a talk in the 1950s on creativity at the American Association, the American Psychology Association, the APA. But at the same time, he worked with colleagues in industry and engineering, like Thomas Sheraton. And he also worked with designers and architects like Buckminster Fuller, where he got the term comprehensive design from. And here, Fuller influenced Arnold quite a bit on the ideas of we have to create this comprehensive design to solve these really big social and sustainable issues. Fuller wrote very famously this book on the operational manual of Spaceship Earth, where he highlights the importance of designing for sustainability. And Arnold points that out in his writing. We have people he worked with like Henry Dreyfuss, the really famous industrial designer. or Bill Gordon, who was after D-Little in kind of like design invention, who also worked with Donald Chern. So here's a kind of like the link to someone else that a lot of people know. And of course, I put György Kepes here close to Arnold, because if I think that if anybody is close to Arnold, it's György Kepes. And why I'm saying this is he had this vision and value series. This is one out of many books that he published, where he brought psychologists, engineers, architects, designers together. Very famously in this exact book, Rudolf Arnheim wrote the first article about visual thinking, where, of course, McKim called later visual thinking. It's in that book. And he brought together people like James Gibson, who brought this whole affordance to design. It is already in György Kepes' work. And so very close to Arnold, I would say, is Kepes. And so when Arnold came to Stanford, he established what he called the Comprehensive Design Division, which is, of course, today the Mechanical Engineering Design Group. And he had, you can see here Bob McKim, John Arnold in the middle, and a graduate student over here. He published work and worked at the Graduate School of Business, and he also was a graphic designer because he had an old printing press where he kind of like developed several of these kind of like prints. And so when he established the Comprehensive Design Division, because of his kind of like visual printing skills, it looked very official. From MIT, he brought two students with him, one called Peter Berkeley, and the other one is Bob Keller. And these are the titles of their master thesis at MIT under the supervision of John Arnold. And you can see here that they just graduated just before Arnold moved from MIT to Stanford. At the same time, he, and you can read about this in a wonderful book called The Making of an Engineer by Jim Adams. He convinced this native Californian called James Adams to do a PhD with him. And in that book, Adams describes how convincing and how inspiring Arnold was, that he was admitted like, this is the place I need to be. And so Jim, very similar to kind of like Arnold, had this interesting intersection between engineering and art, because he did an undergrad in engineering at the California Institute of Technology, and he did, well, he didn't get a degree, but 1 year an art education at the University of California, Los Angeles. And very interesting, in his book, The Making of an Engineer, he describes of how he got into the school. He was dating the daughter of the very famous designer Henry Dreyfuss, who wrote him a recommendation letter to get into the school. And Jim was kind of like the one thing that we talk about him is really he was a maker. Like anybody, like know a lot of people know him here in the room. I think what describes Jim best is a maker. And so he really cared for what is the student shop, which is today the product realization lab. And so these are pictures in the 70s of the student shop. And so Jim even hired this very young Dave Beach in 1974, right after he finished his master thesis, to run the student shop. And Dave, of course, just retired very recently. So here is kind of Jim's work at Stanford, in particular in the product realization lab. And now I'm coming to kind of like the first hire that Arnold brought together. And that is, of course, Robert McKim. Bob, also a native Californian, arrived here in 1958 in the Department of kind of Mechanical Engineering. And he really developed the product design program. And again, very similar to the others, he had a dual education. he studied engineering in the 40s at Stanford. I found this wonderful picture of him when he was an undergrad student. And so Bob was actually very active as a student in terms of sketching and did a lot of visual work. But he also, after his education at Stanford, he did a degree in industrial design at Pratt in New York. And so again, you see this intersection between engineering and arts, engineering, industrial design. And so here I want to quickly point out the wonderful kind of work at the time at Pratt Institute by Rowena Reed Costello. There's a wonderful book about this and about her and her work at Pratt. And so she created these wonderful visual languages that in particular in three-dimensional kind of like objects. And so Bob really had this wonderful education about building three-dimensional models in these kind of wonderful visual form. After his time at Pratt Institute, he started working for Henry Dreyfuss's studio in New York. And Bob very interestingly tells the story that he was quite irritated by the work at Henry Dreyfuss's studio. One, he kind of said, is a lot of the design work they are done was about kind of really the sketching, the two-dimensional work. And he felt as an engineer and coming from Rowena's kind of like education that designers really should also build the thing. And the other irritation was, very famously, Henry Dreyfuss wrote this book, Designing for People, but in actual practice, there were these abstract personas of Joe and Josephine, and they weren't real people. And of course, there were a lot of the ergonomics on the wall, but they never really spoke to real people. And that was an irritation that Bob says he had during his time at Dreyfuss's studio. And so here I want to talk a bit longer about Bob and what he brought to Stanford. And one of the kind of, like as I mentioned, the book, The Experience in Visual Thinking, and of course, we're still teaching this course, Visual Thinking here, and he really started this idea of teaching visual, kind of visual perception, visual thinking, imagining, and so on. And so seeing was about really understanding the world. While imagining, he even created, together with another industrial designer called Nelson van Juda, the dome. And of course, I know many of you still remember the dome. And so this dome is where you can go in and you lay down and you have a projector here and it projected upwards visual imagery, and this was narrated to train your inner imaginative eye. And so it was about kind of like, can we train imagination in the same way we're teaching drawing? And so Bob really had this idea of visual thinking and teaching visual thinking, of seeing, imagining, idea sketching, and mock-up building, which he often calls at the end of the abstract to concrete spectrum. And really interestingly, and here's a conversation that happened in 1967, was Bob, in the context of the larger movement, which is called the design methods movement, which came out of the Imperial College London, was this whole systematic design method. So really the early ideas of design methodology and design processes, and even the term design thinking, at least popularized, was kind of like in this design methods movement. And McKim writes in this paper about kind of like how the systemic design methodology allows to go beyond the visual into verbal and mathematical language, but he also points out how more vivid design methodologies should draw more. And so he emphasizes here that in kind of like visual languages, in impact on design thinking, he outlines these different visual languages that you need to be fluent in kind of your way, and that it impacts your design thinking. And really interestingly for me, and a bit my research, what I've done is he also points out, according to the Gestalt theorist Wertheimer, creative thinking is not the sum of piece mental operation. On the contrary, the creative thinker seeks to perceive the whole pattern or Gestalt to bring order and harmony to the visual image. And of course, for McKim, it wasn't just kind of like the visual on 2D or 3D, the product, but it was more the visual, the image of the entire life of someone. And so that really relates to need finding. And so remember that I asked the question, Bernie, about when did Bob come up with the idea of need finding? Here's the answer. In 1965, exactly the year Bob said he came up with the idea of need finding, he writes in the course abstract, the student uses rational intuitive problem finding procedures to identify a design project within an unexplored area of need. 2 years later, he actually used the term need finding. New product innovation via need finding. So problem finding, need finding. When you know a bit the Wertheimer kind of research and kind of like what he outlined, that's very much kind of like that language. And so in the unpublished need finding chapters that Bob wrote, he expresses that need finding is not a body of knowledge, a method or a technique. Need finding is an awareness. And that comes to kind of like how he brought these kind of ideas together. He was also very much a practicing designer. And so here is one of the invention. He became part of the company called Oxford Laboratory. And here is in 1962, one of his patents. And this is a blood analyzer. And this made him actually quite a bit amount of money that he could be that he was able to buy a ranch up in Skyline. And so you can see here a bit kind of like the practices of design with this really deep kind of like ingrained in this humanistic culture. And so here you can see an outline of what is called the experimental education of the Esalen Institute at Stanford. And so the Esalen Institute was one of these institutes, still exists down in Big Sur, that was really all about this kind of human potential. And Abraham Maslow, in the kind of like at the time, the president of the American Psychology Association, said this is the most exciting experiment in education at the time. And so here you can see some of the workshops that the Esalen Institute gave in the 60s. Fritz Perls taught Gestalt therapy around very much about team dynamics and group interactions, encounter groups. And Halpern taught the kinetic U. There were sessions on walking around Stanford land, on kind of like the history, present and future of Native Americans of the land. And so you can see here this kind of environment, or this kind of like a program really allowed not only at kind of an engineering or design, this kind of humanistic culture, but this was open to the entire Stanford community. And of course, the business school here at Stanford still teaches a course that they call touchy-feely. And that's exactly the kind of like encounter groups that comes out of this. And so you can see here this deeply grounded humanistic culture and kind of like this idea of the human potential. And in particular, this kind of workshops influenced a very young professor just coming from New York. Very good looking, huh? And so Bernie, who tells this in his wonderful book, The Achievement Habit, the whole story of how he came to California and how Arnold hired him. So Arnold was kind of like hired Bernie, and they moved here to California. And of course, he came from Columbia University. And of course, California had some impact on Bernard Roth. And so his education at Columbia University was really mechanical engineering, really technically grounded. He was, his supervisor was Ferdinand Freudenstein, who is often considered the father of modern kinematics. And so Bernie coming to Stanford with a really strong technical ability, but at the same time, and you can see this conflation of these ideas is Bernie, on the one hand, had kinematics working with the Stanford AI lab in the early days, being involved in early AI robotics like Butterfingers. But at the same time, you could see him, for example, with Doug Weil teaching a course called People Dynamics Laboratory. So at the one time, he's solving the biggest problems in kinematics in one class and with his PhD students. At the same time, you see him interacting with students about their personal awareness, about their self-identity, about their self-image and how the self-image relates and is perceived by others. And so again, you can see these two of technical ability and human care really conflating here, of course, in Bernie's work. And so, for me, these kind of like ideas that when we talk about design at Stanford, Matt Kahn brought a fine arts and kind of arts and craft approach with very kind of like artist in resident approach to Stanford. While Arnold, the polymath, who really brought creativity into engineering, into design, who wanted to educate the comprehensivist. Jim Adams with engineering and art. Bob McKim with engineering and industrial design. Bernie with Doug in engineering, but at the same time teaching classes like the People's Dynamics Laboratory. Really grounded in this kind of human potential. And so for me, if we're talking about the origins of Stanford design, I think that's a wonderful image that really brings these different perspectives together into what Arnold called the comprehensive design division. And so how did that kind of comprehensive design division turn into a program? This is a newsletter to the engineering community in 1962. And I'm highlighting a couple of things that are in that newsletter. And so, for example, here at the beginning it says, John Arnold's long-lurching desire to educate the comprehensive designer is starting this kind of program. And then they talk about the interdepartmental spectrum that is coming together. So they're talking about engineering like kinematics, arts like sculpturing, architectural history. Unification, they talk here about unification, which is kind of like the philosophy of design, where Arnold taught the creative process. McKim with rapid visualization, techniques of the comprehensive designer. They talk about that the designers need to be able to verbally and visually communicate to non-designers, and of course the human frontiers. So they work with the medical centers to really identify where are some of the human needs, and to really bring this whole comprehensive approach to educating designers together. And McKim in particular brought the whole kind of like design consultancy practice together. He hired and brought into the program people like Carl Clements, who was an industrial designer from Washington, who was at Hewlett-Packard, very high up as a vice president. Jack Stringer, who was an industrial designer from Philadelphia, who was at IBM, again, very high up. And here at the end, they say something really interesting. They talk about inventions. And they say Stanford-trained designers will be able to adapt, innovate, and even invent more useful and satisfying products. And here, this is, for me, kind of like one of the mind-blowing things. It said this in the article. Professor Arnold and Mr. McKim predict that in the long run, the results of the program will be an upgrading of the design field in the US. What a prediction. I think they should have hired a bit higher here and should just change this to the world. And so here, this is the very first brochure that came out of the program. So when they conceptualized the program, these are the kind of visuals they used in the program. And so they said, we have to teach engineering, the humanities and the behavioral sciences, the arts and industrial design. But rather than just teaching these courses and kind of like independently, they really brought this together into a cohesive program, a comprehensive program, where fluently between arts and engineering, the humanities and industrial design. And so in the kind of phrasing of the Gestalt psychologist, I would call this, the sum is quite different, the whole is quite different to the sum of its parts. And here, and this is one of the really fun, fantastic things that are still in the archive here at Stanford, this is the very first conception of the program. I'll let you quickly look at it. Because for me, this is fascinating. Here you can see the 3 courses by Arnold. The philosophy of design, human factors and comprehensive design. You can see here some of the advanced design art by Matt Kahn, product design and presentation by McKim. And so here you can see the very first conception of the program. How did that program come into being, into the environment? One of the environments I want to point out is, we very famously call this a design loft. What you can see here is pictures of the design loft. And of course, a lot of worldwide design programs call it a studio. We call it a loft. Why? Because it was a loft. This was the loft. And it was built above the student shop. And you actually had to have a ladder to climb up to go in there. So we actually had a design loft. Here are some of the pictures of the kind of creative work and the playfulness of the students. These are all of the kind of like early 70s. McKim brought in Juan to teach Mexican American native dance in an engineering program in the 70s. Who knows this one? It is, I know you can't really see it, but this is called the Robert McKim Memorial Race. And so what they did is, and of course who knows ME310, the paper bike, this is the precursor of the paper bike. So what they did is they had, when the lake, Lagunita Lake still had water in it, they had to kind of like build boats where of course they shouldn't get wet. And so one of the kind of exercises was, for example, to kind of like one way you had to take kind of like the boat this way, and the other way you had to flip it around and go back. And so you had to design for that. And of course here I would say what we would call today is learning through failure. And so all of this kind of like education and community and environment really came together in projects. And this is one of my favorite ones by Bill Potts. Bill had this wonderful creative idea of putting together a project where the dancer actually controls the volume and the sounds. And so the actual movement of the dancer became the instrument. And so I think this is one of these wonderful creative projects that were master student projects at the time in the late 60s. And so, of course, there were many different things that came out of the program, designed by many designers. I know, Perry, I put your kind of like Atlas snowshoes down here. And of course, many of you find yourself in that. And so, many of these kind of like creative designs, all kind of like people were, designers from the Stanford program were involved with them. And so what I hope that this kind of presentation gave you a bit of a glimpse of this obsession that I have about this wonderful project about this history here at Stanford Design. Thank you so much.